Listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, good evening, listeners. Welcome to the Twilight Show with myself, your host, Louise Pickering. We are here this evening to have a wonderful discussion about leading with listening, focusing on one educator's journey through faith, representation and change. So thank you for joining. With me, I have my wonderful guest, Shammi Rahman. I'm going to pass over to you, Shammi, to introduce yourself and what it is that you currently do.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Louise, for inviting me. I'm very excited. I think, just to kind of give everybody, your listeners, a bit of a background if they don't know me. I used to be a religious studies teacher, and obviously we both worked alongside each other and had good times together. And now 3 years ago, I left the classroom to work as a race equality advisor in Hertfordshire for HFL education. But my role is broadened now. Obviously, because of my RE background, it makes sense to support schools with that as well. So yeah, I'm sort of supporting schools across and beyond Hertfordshire, not just there, but in all things belonging, in all things sort of race equity, religious education. There you go.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It would be lovely to kind of hear your insights and your experience on this, because it seems very varied, which is lovely. Okay, so if you're ready to crackle, we'll lead in. So you and I obviously used to have some pretty lively debates in the office. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Why do you? Yeah, they were good. Why do you think disagreement and listening across difference is so important in education and leadership?
Well, I am going to use our example actually, Louise, because we used to have it was so in our office. It was so we were always on fire, and we were always had so many things to talk about, and not just the two of us, the whole office. And I remember that being such an important part of me wanting to come into work, because I looked forward to going in, because I knew that I can talk to anyone about anything, and we could all have lots of interesting conversations, share each other's interesting perspectives. And, sometimes we did have heated debates, didn't we? And we did have disagreements, but actually we still had a laugh. We still had a good time. And in a job where it's so hard anyway, with all the pressures, but we just loved being in each other's company. We loved talking about the latest thing that was being talked about. And I think that's so important as a teacher, being around colleagues where you feel you have permission to do that. And I think it's so important to have that in a leadership space as well. And I think, disagreeing and listening across differences absolutely matters. It doesn't matter what our school community looks like. When you've got a group of human beings in a room, we're all going to disagree on all sorts of things, right? So, and that's just life, even in a family, community. I can't sit with my family for 10 minutes without having an argument about something. It's just who we are, right? But what I think was really lovely, and I think what is really important, is if you have really good, trusted relationships, friendship, healthy, safe. And I say, when people say, oh, you should have a safe space, to talk about what you want, every space should be safe. Everybody should feel, they're not going to get judged if they say something. And if something is said that somebody, you have a relationship to be able to have a conversation kindly and nicely, and it doesn't lead to any problems, because the job is tough as it is, right? And what we want to do is support, feed off each other, disagree with each other. And I think that's so important from a leadership perspective, especially when you're leading a school with so many different families, different perspectives, etc. And if we can't do it as adults and we have a problem with certain subjects, certain topics, that's going to impact on how we make our decisions and how we see and view things, what we allow to talk about in our space and what we don't. So yeah, I think that's, and I do go back to the times that we had, in the office together, and there was a big group of us, and I remember the children saying they loved coming into the humanities office because they could feel that energy. They could feel it. And that is so important for our children to know, because if they witness it with the adults, we are demonstrating to them how you can be good friends and still work together, disagree, and have intellectual conversations that doesn't result in falling out or anything like that. And even if they do, we're able to go and they see us, sitting in the, I don't know, sixth form cafe, having a chat and carrying on with the argument. It's So that's where I feel that's so key.
And I think it's really important. I think actually I think in the humanities and social sciences teams, we're automatic, I think, that we are discursive subjects. We are used to doing critical thinking, analysis, considering different perspectives, and then taking a step back and evaluating all of those perspectives. But it doesn't, obviously, it doesn't just happen in humanities and social sciences. It happens in all subjects. There's always elements of discussion, and therefore there will always be different opinions on, even in maths, how to solve a problem, how to teach the solving of the problem, the different techniques, which one is more preferable in a classroom with a certain cohort. And actually, it's really important that it's not, your thoughts on this, it's not just tolerating different opinions. It's actually saying this is a chance for me to learn. And whilst it wouldn't have been my go-to opinion, or something even that I'd even considered previously to the conversation, but it's not just about the tolerance, it's about celebration. Like, actually, I'm really pleased. I mean, you mentioned psychological safety. I'm really pleased you felt you could disagree. And that is so important at all levels, as we talked about working relationships, in leadership, in any industry, to have a team that comes together and says, I'm thinking this way, I'm thinking maybe teaching it this way, or I'm not quite sure. And you always reach a better decision when you're able to safely say, I disagree, and here's why I disagree. What do you think? And I think
it's
you're also
healthy. It's a really healthy thing to do. And Louise, I come from the Islamic tradition. My family are not particularly hardcore religious, but they were very practicing. They don't, they come from Bengali origin. But one of the things I was inspired by my teachers. That's why I went into teaching. One of the things that I learned as a young person studying philosophy, Western philosophy, I fell in love with Western philosophy because I remember going to our A-level class and our RE teacher said, "Is there a God? How do you know there is a God?" And I remember we were a group of Muslim children, 16-year-olds, never ever asked that question, right? Because if you ask that to your parents, like, they'd have a shoe and say, like, how dare you ask that question?
Yeah, it's a given. Yeah,
you don't ask that question. And I used to have a lovely, I wish I could get back in touch with her. I don't know where she is, but one of my classmates, Kerry, she was the only atheist in the class. She was the only challenge. And I don't know what we would have done without her, but we did 2 years together of discussing and debating. And I kind of, through that, realized how, and actually in the Islamic tradition in medieval times, they were doing this. They were asking people from different traditions, different parts of the world, come, we want you to challenge us because we want to test whether what we're thinking actually makes sense. And you can't do that unless you invite people who completely disagree with you. So it was always, people have been doing this for hundreds of years, and it's incredibly healthy and important if you've got a really good base for that. but I do find that sometimes, in the busyness and the pressure of everything, that and maybe, in some environments, those conversations can turn into something, that doesn't help. But I do believe that when people have got time and they have time to think and reflect, we all thrive on that. We all thrive on that. And that's why I became really fascinated and passionate about Western philosophy. And I didn't realize until I went to university that you can't understand Islamic philosophy, Christian philosophy, Jewish philosophy if you haven't studied the Greeks. And so all of that is intertwined. And you and I know, even in our own subject, our interests, it's so much more, isn't it? The more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. The more you discover. And I think one of the great things that working with colleagues who really embrace that is that you are, without realizing, demonstrating that to the children that you are working around. They pick up on this stuff. They can feel that this is a good space. So yeah, communicating. My job isn't just about, some of the conversations I've had with some of my colleagues, where they go in and help support schools with, teaching maths or English or, whichever subject. When I'm doing race equity work or working with staff around how to talk about race, I am so hyper aware of every single person in that room or in that hall that I do not want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. So when I'm delivering training around religious education and how to teach RE, it's a completely different experience. It's like, right, you can use this resource and we can look at this technique and we can, look at these writing frames and etc. But when you're talking about subjects around how to talk about race, just making sure everybody in the room is comfortable. But equally, I have to be able to push and challenge and allow people to challenge. But it's so important to meet people at different stages and accept that we're all at different stages, that we've all got a different story behind us. We've all got different experiences, and everybody's intention. You can't know what's going on in people's, their hearts. So being really mindful of that, I think and we have to remind ourselves, because we're human, and you can fall into getting annoyed about what someone has said or what they may have meant by that and all of that. So
this leads in really nicely. Actually thinking, and what you've just said has got me thinking about some things. It's actually one thing that I think all colleagues, may feel at some point in their career is, how do you balance honesty with not making people uncomfortable? Is that, where do you find the line, particularly when you're kind of educating maybe other staff, colleagues on, issues of equity or representation, or even things like racism and misogyny? How do you temper those conversations so they feel constructive and safe, but you're still able to get your point across?
One thing I've learned, I would say, over the last 3 years is, it sounds really cheesy, like be kind. That has to be at the heart of what you're about to say and what you're going to. And the best way to judge how far a conversation goes is based on your relationship with that person. If you don't know each other, and actually people can say things without intending to mean anything by it, but if you don't know that individual, you can make all sorts of assumptions about them that are not true. So I think being starting with facts, talking about research, not making it about the, like, you and I, for example, Louise, if we're having a chat, if we're talking about a topic, talk about the research or whatever it is that we're talking about, and take the conversation from there rather than making it personal. And if people want to share personal opinions, I think just making sure there's an understanding that, I might not be right. I haven't got the answers to all of this, Louise. I'm just doing my best. And I feel that none of us do. When I get with my school friends who are all British, Bengali, Pakistani, we all disagree on, like, really simple stuff that you'd think we'd all agree on. So I do think that, being mindful, starting with facts, looking at research, talking about that, and you know, saying, you know, sort of saying, you know, I'm not, I might be wrong, or I want to inquire, you know, making it an inquiry rather than imposing a particular view. You know, when you're with your close family and friends, you can impose all you want and have a good old argument, right? But in a professional space, you've got to think, you know, you've just got to be mindful. If I, you know, am I saying anything that's offensive? Will I, or even checking in? Because most people will actually respect the fact that we are even thinking about that. You know, I've got many colleagues who will say, Shammi, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, and apologies for, and often I'll say, honestly, don't worry about it. Just say what you need to say. I'm not going to, you cannot offend me. So I'm me. Somebody else might not say that. So just, yeah, I don't know if that helps anybody listening.
It does. I think the main crux there is you were talking about having an underlying relationship, and that's where the safety comes from. There is a relationship there, and you take time to foster that and cultivate it. So you then do, both of you then, for however many people are having the discussion, then feel safe enough to say, because you know it may be you're able to separate the personal from the professional. And whilst it's perfectly human, isn't it, to when someone disagrees with you, or maybe even, you know, attempts to give you constructive criticism, for many of us, you know, there's an automatic shutdown. And can I speak for myself here? You know, I welcome constructive criticism, but at the time, sometimes I'm not expecting it. I just think, oh, and I shut down. But then it's so much easier to open back up again in that conversation, take the minute of the, got something, someone's saying something bad, how am I going to take this? Quick, put the face on. To then reassess and be like, hang on a second, this is just my colleague that I work with every day. And your brain then relaxes a bit more, and your nervous system relaxes, and you're then more receptive to what's being said and to listening to the alternative opinion. So I think, yeah, two things. It is exactly about having those safe relationships, and they take time. They do take time. But also being able to say, do you know what, this feels like a personal attack, but let's remove myself from the situation a minute and reassess. Is this about me as a person, or is this about my role and my work? And it is really difficult. And I think that's for many people, including myself, that's a lifelong career journey. Not taking things personally.
All of us, you know, we're working in, you know, when we're working in education, there are, you know, certain ways of presenting ourselves, and what, you know, depending on which audience we're talking to, you know, that what you've just touched on just now about maybe saying something that you're not sure, or it's come across as upsetting. But when schools or environments have already invested in time in opening up those questions deliberately and not shutting down conversations, you will find that actually that doesn't happen. It's when we make people feel uncomfortable, when we start saying, you can't say that, you know, it's understanding the guide, the rules, you know, if it's understanding what is acceptable, what is not. Things that are really blatantly offensive, most of us are not going to say anything that's deliberately offensive. You know, I don't know, you know, I know some people that will, okay, but most of us won't. So I think we know, but if there is it doesn't happen naturally. It has to be like with anything, right? If you're learning to teach how to manage a classroom, you need to learn that stuff. You need to learn about behavior management. Some people think, it just happens through osmosis. No, you either learn the hard way, or you learn from experts and people who have trialed it and, you know, tried different environments, and you can pick up on what works. Every school is different. Every system is different. But it's the same with having conversations where people disagree. If there has been no work done to create that safe space in the workplace, then there will be problems. There will be problems. So it has to be deliberate. That's basically what I do. I support schools with that journey. So yeah.
So now, we're just going to hold fire a second. So now is a really good time to just kind of highlight and thank our sponsors. So this show is kindly brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in many schools around the world. So feel free, once the show is obviously concluded, to go and have a look at the amazing resources. I know this summer a lot of books have come out. So yeah, thank you to those sponsors. Okay, so Shammi, moving on, you've obviously talked about kind of personal experiences. So if we, and kind of the way that we should be in kind of engaging with our colleagues, looking at your personal upbringing, growing up in Luton, we've had many discussions about this. Very different to my upbringing, but it's always really interesting to hear about different people's life stories. Your family history, it shaped the way that you listen to and lead others. Can you please kind of explain to us a bit how that's affected you?
Yeah, I think, if I start from, where do I start? This, these stories are so deep and long. Yeah, I suppose, I didn't know this until like 3 or 4 years ago, that my grandfather came here. He was part of he joined the British Army when he was a young man, and he was, our families were part of the British Empire. They saw themselves as British. So my grandfather came over. He fought in Burma, and he then left Bangladesh, joined the army, and came and settled here in Camberwell in London. Opened up an Indian restaurant. He used to work in the Science Museum. My dad was always very proud of that. He used to say, "Your dada worked in the Science Museum," and and all of this. And my dad had a difficult time. He had lots of health problems. But I look back at our history and I think, wow, when you really think about it, because you don't think about these things, you just crack on, right? And I think about my family legacy, and it absolutely has shaped how I do my job, how I think, what I see. It does, because our way of looking at the world is through who we are, right? So I think about, my grandparents would have survived famine after famine. Yeah, we had so many famines in Bangladesh, India, Bengal famine after famine. Millions died. They survived that. My mum, even today, when we go out, even if we're going down the road for a meal, she always carries food with her. It drives us mad. We'll say, "Mum, we're literally going out for a meal. Why are you packing food in your bag? You never know when you might need food." And it's only after learning about my own family history and about everything we're learning now, of course, that they were starving. This is what she knew. I remember my dad, whenever we used to eat rice, he would check the bin after we'd finished a meal to see if we've wasted any food. And we'd get really annoyed, like, "Oh, Dad's so strict. He's always checking the bin. Oh, why is he so fussy about food?" And he used to pick up a grain of rice, and he used to say, "Do not waste a single grain of rice. Do you know what this rice means?" And we had no idea. We were just like, "Yeah, all right, Dad," And I look back and I think, oh my goodness, I didn't know about what our family history, what Indians and Bangladeshis, what they suffered. And now I look at what my grandfather coming over, and why did I have to wait till I was in my 40s to learn that my grandfather fought in the army for this country? What difference would it have made to so many of us if we knew those stories about our relationship with who we are, why we are here? And I think about the racism that my parents experienced, I experienced. It was just part of what we did. It's part of how we. I grew up in quite a hard. We were poor, as in so poor. And I'm not, I'm gonna share this. My home, our walls were so damp that you could put your finger through the wall. That is the level of poverty. And I look back and I think, how on earth did I end up doing what I'm doing? How did I survive school? How did I not go down the road of violence? Because we had violence. We had police vans every week outside our school. It was tough in the 80s and the 90s growing up. And I look back and I think, how did our parents, because I used to watch my mum, she'd get spat at on the street. And as children, we couldn't do anything. We were just small children. You'd watch people loose, let their dogs loose to scare us. There's so many negative stories I can talk to you about. But, my parents never, ever, my mum, this is going to make you laugh. She says all the time, she says, I am 100% proud of being British. I am British. And she's really proud of being British. And she said, because of this country, you have free education. You are all got degree. You went to university. You know, they're so grateful for everything. They're grateful for food. They're grateful that we didn't have to worry about a roof. Even though the house was falling apart, we had a roof over our head. We had food. We had school. They didn't care what kind of school we went to. We were going to school and learning. And when I talk to some of my Pakistani friends, dads, who lived during the sort of partition, the stories they have told us, you know, it's just mind-blowing, horrible, nasty stuff. And I remember one of my friends' dad saying, you know, Shammi, when you know, I used to have a business in West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and you know, to travel across was so dangerous, you could get killed. But he said one thing about the Bengalis, you know, they didn't have shoes on their feet, but they would go to school every day. And, you know, you pick up on all these little stories, which mean nothing at the time. But as you grow up as an adult, you think, wow, this is what our families and our parents, and even though they had nothing, they still managed to save money and feed and send money back home to feed their starving extended family, build water pumps, medical centers in remote areas. While, I mean, it's just like, how did they do all of that? And I realized the reason why our parents never worried about racism, even though they were experiencing it all the time, much harder than what we experienced. I look back and I think that's why they didn't care, because what they had, you know, the suffering, the starvation, the you know, the fact that their children will not have to worry about those things, that was a blessing. So racism, well, just ignore it. Just ignore it. Just smile. So I think that absolutely.
Well, actually, I kind of want to bring.
Yeah. So listening to stories is really important. No, what I'm saying is listening to people and hearing them properly, and not making assumptions. And everybody's got a story. It doesn't matter who we are, black, white, Asian, whatever. We've all got family history, and respecting that, because that shapes who we are. And, you know, I could talk about this, but I think this stuff is really important. Honoring our past voices, all of us, our shared history, because it actually unites us. It brings us together.
There's something I kind of wanted to talk to you about. I know you just touched on this. First of all, thank you for sharing those stories, because they're deeply personal, and it's wonderful to hear them. And I think it's really important that we do hear those kinds of stories, because, you know, we've all experienced different things, and it sounds like your family and your ancestors have been through a lot. And actually, like you said, when you're meeting colleagues at work or you're meeting students, you are bringing that shared history with you. And, you know, some of us have experienced it, some of us haven't. And when you're trying to build those relationships and bridge that gap, whether it's with students or staff or families, it's really important to bear that in mind. And that's where the kindness comes from. It's not a superficial token, oh, how, you know, lovely to see you. It's actually a consideration of someone's personal life experience. So thank you for that. I wanted to kind of touch upon, you know, you mentioned that you weren't aware, or you know, to the extent of your family's involvement in some of the wars and kind of their role in history. And I wanted to touch upon, it's quite a controversial topic, I think, the idea of an ethnocentric curriculum. I think, you know, particularly in all curricula, you know, this kind of focus we have when we think particularly about history. You know, in British schools, we have a tendency to study World War I, World War II, but from a very British perspective. And sometimes we neglect to talk about the impact of, you know, the expanse of the empire, and how soldiers were pivotal from different parts of the empire, but also the brutality that they experienced, and how that influences people today. And actually, sometimes, you know, I wanted to get your thoughts on. I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you feel we have this ethnocentric curriculum? Do you feel like do you think like it's being considered enough? Are we tackling it in schools, and what should we do about it to improve it?
Some schools are doing great work. getting the balance right. It's not about either. And when we say British, what do we mean? I'm British. I remember someone once saying to me, Shammi, we need to teach our British history. And I had to remind the colleagues in the room that half the school are British. They might not be white, black, Asian. We're all British. We have a shared history. And that may not have come from a bad place. That may have come from just that they actually do see history from a white perspective. And that's very common. And that doesn't mean they're being nasty. It shows that, no matter, and how widely read, how widely do we read? How much do we read? Do we repeat the same thing over and over and over again? Are we widening our reading materials as teachers? You can't teach everything in the curriculum. You have to pick what there's a limited time, right? But what we can do is educate ourselves to think and read more broadly. We've got access to lots of different scholarly work now in a way that we didn't have, say, Louise, when we were growing up. We've got great people coming through with so much great work. But I'm
old, Shammi.
Sorry, no, we're still young, obviously. Yeah. But times are changing. We've got more open conversations. Yes, it can be controversial if you want to make it controversial. Learning new knowledge is not controversial. It goes back to our earlier conversation about disagreeing and inviting people. That shouldn't be controversial. We are in the business of education. Education is about learning, about widening our horizons, right? Why should it be controversial? And also, I, as someone who has championed religious education, I've always been a really big advocate of making sure we're teaching Christianity really well, because it is, if we want to understand history, if we want to understand literature in this country, you do need to understand Christianity. And it goes back to another earlier comment I said about understanding the Greeks and everything that they passed on. But what often happens in religious education is we talk about the Greeks and we fast forward and jump over a really significant period and go straight into, St. Thomas Aquinas, or, that there's philosophers in between that actually tell us the full story, a bit like history. We erase and omit. This is all part of the full story. So I don't think it's about, the ethnocentric lens or the ethnocentric curriculum. And I'll give you an example. This is probably related to something that you probably going to talk about later on. But I'll give you, an example of what, let's say, Black and Asian teachers do when they look for jobs, right? If they're looking for work and they're thinking about which school they're going to apply to, the first thing they do is they go on the school website. They look at the history curriculum and the English curriculum, and they look at the values of the school, and they think, do I want to apply and work in this school? What does their history curriculum, and what is the makeup of the children and the community in that school? If it is if it is like what it was when we were at school and it hasn't changed much, it's, they're going to think twice. They're going to think twice about applying. And so you will see there is some amazing work happening in schools, but I do think all of this is about balance. It's about making sure there is a balance, and that what you are teaching is it's about education. It's about knowledge. Who was it? I went to listen to Carla, I think it was, and I believe, this is my personal opinion. I think we should be learning about. Study English literature, study, Western philosophy, but also learn about other classical traditions. Widen your horizon. Don't say, well, we can't learn about this, so we're just going to learn about that. Try to, make a decision, but open up our children's eyes to other lenses, other traditions, because that's how you open people's hearts. That's how you open people's minds. And once you've done that, you don't need to talk and teach everything. Once you've given, as adults, once you're on the journey yourself, nothing can stop you. You become unstoppable. One of the things I really loved, I've always said to you know, when students have said, "Oh, I learn about Christianity, I'm not even Christian," and I will show them examples of why you need to understand the Old Testament and the New Testament. How is it linked to some of the books that you're going to be reading later on in year 10 and year 11? In you know, it's all linked. Same way, you know, if we want to understand St. Thomas Aquinas, you know, a lot of my RE colleagues who teach theology or religious studies or Christianity, or some of the Christian philosophers, you know, St. Thomas Aquinas is one of my favorites. You cannot understand St. Thomas Aquinas' work if you haven't done any work around Islamic philosophy, because all his work comes from Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina. So there's, I mean, I could spend hours talking about this, but I won't, because it will take up the whole session. But they're all intertwined. You know, they're all intertwined, and the more you learn, the more we realize we, you know, one big, massive human family. And all this race equality work that I do, what happens is you go through that, but actually you come out of it realizing, do you know, it goes beyond, you know, beyond skin, beyond faith, beyond, you know, you have to learn about all the different cultures, different traditions to come out of it, to realize actually we've all got really interesting stories to tell and lots of interesting pasts, and that we should use to our advantage, not disadvantage. Use it to unite rather than make it a controversial issue.
And that's interesting, actually, because I'm just kind of thinking about how this relates to our situation in social sciences. And I know a lot of exam boards, and we talk about literature and reading and kind of how a syllabus is constructed. Many exam boards are now issuing apologies for the fact that their textbooks, their literature has largely come from white, middle class, male lenses, you know, and voices. And actually, it sounds silly, but I myself hadn't even considered it, you know, till about 5 or 6 years ago. And I'm looking at a psychology textbook and I'm like, right, there's another white man. Right, there's another white man. Oh, look, he's got an opinion on gender. And whilst, of course, you know, white male perspectives are so important, there should be a conversation, even in departments, even if your syllabus is saying, you know, this is the key literature. It's our duty as educators to kind of then say, actually, this isn't on the syllabus, but this reflects our students and their life experiences. And so when we're talking about the founding fathers of sociology or the founding fathers of psychology, there were many founding fathers of psychology and sociology that were Black. They were not white. They were not all male, but we seem to have resigned them to the history that we don't study. And so I think it's really important, despite having a tight syllabus, and I know it's difficult because of teaching time and allocation, but, you know, even if we're considering setting pre-reading or homework, to then think, okay, this is what the exam board says. Is this representative enough? Are my students getting different worldviews for them to actually engage? And it's not just about passing the exam. It's about developing a well-rounded individual that can see different points of view. But yeah, thank you. I think that's really interesting.
I'm not going to disagree with you on that. I've got a couple of things to say about that. I think, yes, what we have to be mindful of, and I say this all the time, is we don't need to add to our existing workload, right?
Yeah.
But when you learn about things yourself, it automatically comes in through your teaching. You are able to find ways to complement what's already in the syllabus without making it a huge, massive task. And on the topic of white men, I think, given that a lot of the literature that we have access to that has shaped society has been influenced by it, it is important for us to study those texts. So I'm not of the view that you should get rid of all of that. I disagree with that, actually. And in fact, the people that have inspired me are white middle class men. You know, and that doesn't mean I think that it should only be taught from that perspective. We just need to be, again, as we evolve, mature, grow, learn more, we need to realize that actually there's a whole wave of voices that have been completely erased. We need to bring them back. We need to, bring them in. But I'm going to go back to my own experience. a lot of the Islamic literature and learning that I have had access to as a British Muslim Bengali girl growing up in Britain, haven't been anywhere else. I went to Bangladesh twice, 3 times in my life now. I went first time as an 8-year-old with my dad, but I had to learn. I learned how to pray. I learned how to fast, but I didn't study Islam. I learned from my RE teachers and from my parents, actually, because my parents, and everybody's got different interpretations, so don't we know that? But I was raised knowing that Muslim women set up universities centuries ago. They were mathematicians. They were warriors. I was taught the backwardness of my religion when I went into school until I came across great RE teachers who said, no, women are incredibly powerful. The Prophet Muhammad's wife was a businesswoman, and, one of his wives was a warrior and a scholar teaching men. This is in 7th century Arabia, and people can argue with it all you want. If you study this stuff, through an academic lens, you learn so much more. And I look at a lot of my access to that kind of knowledge has been through the devotion and the life's work of white, middle-aged, British and American men who literally devoted their life to studying classical Arabic and translating those texts into English for people like me to have access to understand. And they had to be from here to be able to put, translating classical ancient languages into English for people to understand is a very difficult task, right? And it took a lot of white and some of our greatest scholars that have done the most amazing translations of the Quran are Jewish. Some of the greatest scholars are, come from Jewish heritage. So I think the more and that's why I'm really passionate about this, I think the more we really come out of our, not just the syllabus, but conversations and broaden that a bit, like how we used to really have those fiery conversations, you learn things that you just didn't know. And just by knowing, it just blows your mind, right? It opens your heart and makes you more compassionate. So yes, we do need to think about how we're presenting knowledge through one lens. We can widen that out the more we learn, but we mustn't neglect the fact that actually a lot of the world has been shaped by the views of maybe a small group of people. And we do need to understand, these texts to understand everything else. And there has to be a shared understanding so we can all have conversations. Yeah, so I don't know. It's different, maybe.
No, I think it's important. Like, this isn't about erasing
my view.
One lens. Yeah, but I think it's important. This is not about, demonizing how history has been. This is one lens. This is one perspective, and it is very important. Of course, it is. But actually, there are many more.
Louise, my children are white, right?
Yeah.
They don't. When they were little, people used to think I was their nanny because they got blue eyes like you, white skin, and dark brown hair. My daughter looks more like you than she does. So what's been really interesting is the world that I've had to teach my children about this stuff, because they experience the world differently to their Black and Asian friends. They're very aware of it because they had me as their mum, right? So it's going to be hard not to understand that stuff. But one thing we all realized was this: I took them to Bangladesh 3 years ago for the first time. They'd never been. And for the first time, they'd been in an environment where they were the minority. They've never experienced that. And I didn't know that they had never experienced that because I'm just their mum, right? I'm just their mum. They go to school. We do usual thing. But what I found was really, really powerful was this. We were on some family trip walking up, I can't remember, to the border of India, really beautiful, tea garden, it's just gorgeous. And we were walking, and one of the things, my daughter, she's 17 at the time, I think she was, and she was moaning about everybody pointing at them, because obviously you got 2 white kids walking around in Asian clothes, and everybody, especially her, because she's wearing the traditional Asian clothes, and everywhere we went, people were pointing, go, Shada Manush, which means white person, white person. My son thought it was hilarious. He's a teenage boy. He's like, oh, that's really funny. They keep calling us white people, because they don't get called that when they're here. My daughter found it really offensive. She said, imagine we did that to black people or Asian people here. You know, you would be, that's so out of order. And she took it really personally. And then I just said, look, people are not used to seeing you walking, you know, two white kids walking around. They're not used to that around here. You know, there might be maybe in the city where there's, you know, even then. But we had this moment where we were walking and my daughter just stopped me, like just out of the blue. And she said, Mum, I've just realised something. She said, are you always the only brown person in the room when you like go to meetings and stuff? And I said, yeah. I said, yeah, but I'm used to it. And she just sort of said, oh my goodness, I didn't realise that, because she's never, ever, my kids will never have to worry about that. And it was like almost like a light bulb moment for all three of us. We're like, oh yeah, the only reason why you've understood that, I had to take them to Bangladesh for them to understand what it's like to be that one person. And I didn't even think about it, to be honest. I just thought, I don't really look at it like that. I'm quite, you know me, Louise. I myself, as I am here, as I, you know, I don't.
We love that, though. We love that.
I don't care. You know, I'll go in any space and I will be like this. You know, you will find me as me. And I don't think everybody does feel comfortable being themselves. But I've learned that actually life's too short. You know, you just be yourself. You know, don't pretend to be anything else. And people will accept you. Some people won't. They don't like it. But I think that story about my children was a real wake-up call for me, that I realised, oh yeah, they don't experience the world in the way that I do, and some of their friends will, and they never will. And it is not their fault. And it's like that with all of us. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Shammi.
No, please.
We've got a bit pushed for time, but we've got so many good things that I kind of want to touch on. You've mentioned about, you just spoke about kind of, you know, the fact that your daughter had said, you know, are you often the only brown woman in the room and in meeting spaces? And obviously, I know a lot of amazing work's being done, particularly in the educational space at the moment. Space at the moment with, you know, conferences like REND, trying to kind of to kind of have those discussions and to bring educators together, and so colleagues know there is a space to discuss issues and to feel and to unite. But with that in mind, you know, what does this lack of presence, because there is a lack of presence in these rooms. There is I think in many schools, I know lots of schools are doing great work with regards to kind of, you know, staff body and representation, particularly at SLT level, because that's something, of course, the government quite rightly focuses on. But thinking about colleagues' experiences about applying for a job, that's something I'd never considered, that they'd be looking at the website and thinking, do these values align? And it's not just do their values align with me as a human, do they align with my history? Do I feel like what you're going to teach is going to represent me as a colleague? And I think it's really important, and I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this, about the impact of the lack of presence, of the lack of diversity or the lack of representation in schools, the impact that has at leadership level, and how that might trickle down into school.
It's massive. Well, I don't know where to start with that. It's absolutely huge.
Sorry, it's a big question.
No, good question. Really good question. I'm glad you asked me it. I think, you know, what's really interesting about REND is you know, and I go from one space to another, and what I often see is, you know, and I see, you know, the pictures of big gatherings in Westminster or wherever, you know, and it's so clear. You know, you go to REND and you're in the space of like 500 to 600. Some of these events are so huge, 500 to 600 racially minoritized educators. But when you see other events happening, you can count the number of black and brown people on one hand, maybe two, you know. And I think we are all in each other's echo chambers, and we need to mix it up a bit. And I think it's really obvious to me because I am moving in and out of different spaces all the time, right? And I see it. And I'm often always the only one that speaks about this stuff because I do. And I feel that's quite important for me to point out. So this is in the most respectful way, obviously. You know, I'm always mindful. I don't want to upset anybody, but at the same time, some things need to be said. But when is it going to change? And why are we struggling? You know, this idea that, you know, we're really hard to reach is absolute nonsense. We're not hard to reach. We're there. And REND is proving that there are hundreds of educators from Black and brown backgrounds, but they don't seem to be in the spaces where the decisions are being made.
No.
So I'm going to be really, you know, blunt about this. You know, that's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. That's why I left the classroom. I left the job that I love. Now, I love being in the classroom. You know that, Louise. You've worked with me.
Oh, yeah.
You know how
You're
much.
so passionate.
You know, and I did not want to leave the classroom. But I knew, you know, when you work within a school and you experience things, you know, 19 years in different schools, I always knew racism was a problem, but I was one of those people that kind of denied it. And I used to think, no, because let me tell you, my mum isn't happy about the work that I do. She says to me, why are you talking about racism? English people don't like this. They're quiet people. Leave them alone. That's what she says. She says, don't talk about racism. People don't like it. You know, go back to the school. You know, teaching is an honourable job. My mum said, go back to school. Go back. She says that. And I said, no, Mum, there's a massive problem. I'm not afraid to speak about this. And I'm not afraid to provide solutions and bring people together. And I think what is really important is that, how do I put this? You know, it isn't that difficult when you bring people together, because I've seen it done in the county that I'm working for. I've seen, you know, a conference room full of CEOs and head teachers throwing themselves at this work and doing the most amazing work, predominantly all white head teachers. You know, I have been so inspired, like, you know, throwing themselves in areas, you know, really difficult, tough situations, really going out of their comfort zones. It can be done. But we have to work together and we have to call out what we need to call out. And it's not about being rude or unkind. It's actually going to help all of us, because there are lots of problems that can be solved together. But because, you know, not everybody, I would say a large majority, afraid to talk about it. Now, I think once you get over that hurdle, you really are unstoppable, and you've got each other's backs. You're helping each other. And, you know, the whole thing about anti-racism, where anti-racism is really important, because you can, when you hear racist comments, you know it's really, you know when it's rude and offensive. It's the I'm not racist. I'm going to be, being nice doesn't solve these problems. Just, but I'm, you know, we're all just going to get along together. We need to look at our policies. We need to look at all this from different angles, different lenses. And the things that, Louise, you just wouldn't even see, not because it's just like my children. There are things that they just won't see that will be clear as day to someone like me or a Black person. So I think, you know, we need change at leadership. You know, a lot of the work that I've been doing is with leadership, because if leaders don't understand and won't take the lead, you can appoint as many EDI leads and educate as many people as you want, but having someone on a, you know, a timetable of I don't know how many lessons a week to tackle all the issues around equality and diversity across the school isn't going to cut it. It's got to come from the top, and people have got to understand it. And it is a process, and it takes time, and it's challenging. But if we are doing it together and helping each other without judgment, honestly, I say this every time, we can move mountains together, but it ain't going to happen when we're not in the room. It just ain't going to happen. And it certainly ain't going to happen if people feel that they can't really speak. You cannot ask children and racially minoritized staff to solve the problems within a school. Also, if you talk about this stuff, you know, when I experienced things, some of the things that I experienced, my advice that was given to me was, don't talk about this stuff. You won't get a job in the town. You won't get a job in this area. You won't get, and I thought, well, that's ridiculous. And I didn't believe in anti-racism work before I started this. I just think, oh no, this is all nonsense stuff. It's all very well, some people saying they've never experienced racism. That's not true. I think that is wonderful if you have lived that existence and you haven't experienced it or you haven't witnessed it. May there be many of us that live in that, you know, but that's not true for many others.
That's something I kind of wanted to ask you about, Shammi. What the difference, you're talking about the term anti-racism. I kind of, can you kind of define that to us so we know the difference between when we talk about what that really means?
It's recognizing that, you know, if we don't recognize that the systems that are in place, our systems, our policies, the way we recruit, all of that, that are working in a way to advantage one group over the other. And people might not agree with that, but you just have to look, honestly, now we've got AI, it's no excuse. Just Google it, just AI it, look at all the research on, you know, what's happening in education with the, you know, with all the reports coming out, look at what's happening in social care, in you know, in healthcare. There's just report after report after report after report. So, you know, nobody can deny it all you want, you know, people can deny it. But I think recognizing that the systems are not there to advantage and help everybody. They actually work against certain groups. If we don't agree with that, and if we think that's all nonsense, actually racism isn't a problem, then it doesn't matter how much we try to do all the diversity work in the world. If you don't agree with that, there's nothing that will change in your school. And that is the difference. Because if we think that no, everything's fine, then, you know, then there will be no, you can give colleagues or teams a task to say, look, you know, look at your curriculum, see if you can bring in resources. Can you, you know, make sure you're bringing in Black scholars, or, you know, in Christianity, I often say, let's talk about, in Islam, you know, in Judaism, you know, it's diverse. These religious group, you know, communities are very, very diverse. Bringing that in and thinking about how we teach has to be something that is part of what we do as educators. But if we don't believe that it's a problem, it's not going to change. So I think that's the difference. I mean, I could spend ages on this, but I'll give you an example. You know, when people say, I don't know, sometimes, you know, Shammi, I don't see colour, I just see you.
The microaggressions. This is something I wanted to touch on. Like I have some colleagues have experienced that, and so I welcome hearing, you know, your thoughts on this, because this is something we do really need to dig deep in. And we're talking about processes in schools and policies, and they are important, but actually the day-to-day interactions we're having, you know, I know some colleagues in previous schools are frightened to use the word Black because they're worried, is that offensive? Yeah, and they're unsure on the terms that are actually, you know, politically correct, but they're too frightened because they're too frightened to ask the question. And you're quite right, actually AI, you know, tends to be a fairly non-judgmental space. I mean, there's a time that ChatGPT has and I'm like, what? How dare you?
It's another podcast.
You don't know me. You think you do, but actually there are places you can go to, and ideally you have that psychologically safe school or friend or colleague where you can go and say, actually, is this term acceptable? I mean, I've had conversations with staff recently where I've said, look, I've just made this comment and I've made this assumption. Is that an acceptable comment for me to make? And they're quite safe in saying yes or no. And I'm like, please educate me, because I don't want to go around bumbling around life offending people. And it's important that we have these conversations.
Yeah, but one person will say to you, oh, that really, you know, no, you can't. And then the next person you speak to will say, no, I don't mind. You have to talk to people to understand. Everybody's got a different interpretation. The best thing, so one of the things I do is do racial literacy training. so we look at lots of different languages, words that are used and what they mean. And the more, and it's like, if you're a languages teacher, or, I used to teach religious language, the way different languages is, interpreted, especially when we're looking at religious literature, univocal, equivocal language, all of that. And, if you're teaching English language, if you're teaching a foreign language changes. It's the context that also, what is right for us might not be right for somebody else. What is right in a certain period of time might have changed because we know more, and the more we educate, it's just learning. And the more we learn together, the more we become more comfortable with what we understand. I've got, I go and deliver training and someone from the Black community say, well, Shammi, I don't agree with you. And I'm like, great. This is a great example of showing everybody that we can't agree. Why are we all there are some things that we know that are offensive, and actually there are some offensive words that are acceptable in other countries where teachers might be coming from, but they don't know that it's offensive in the UK. So having racial literacy training, especially for people, and some of our colleagues who are from a generation where some words were acceptable then and not now, just talking to each other breaks down all those fears. Everybody's so scared of offending one another. And then one of the things I often get is, but the children use the N-word or whatever with each other. Do you know what? What people want to say outside of school is their business. What they want to, if you're working in a school and you want to make sure you're setting the right example, you're setting children, and it's a professional space, it's an educational space, decide what your boundaries are. Talk about what we will allow and what we won't. And context matters. And if children are using offensive language, say no. We won't allow that in our school because you might not think of offensive. Some people, there are certain words that might be acceptable on in one space or another, but here we say no. Why? And if you explain people the history of the language, the word, the etymology, people do understand. They get it. But often I think those conversations can't even be had because we're scared to say the word black. As you said. So I think what I often find is that when I deliver training, you see where the confident staff are. And I always say to our head teachers who are sitting in the room, I say, look out for the staff in the room that actually have been doing their reading, that, they know, they probably don't know, or they haven't been given permission to talk about it. Use their knowledge, share it with each other, and actually the more you talk to each other, the more comfortable you become and the more you can educate. And somebody else, I don't know, 2 years' time might come along and say, actually, I'm not sure that's correct because we don't really say that. We did some training in our own company and, I had the word Pole with a cross on it. And one of our colleagues who's Polish said, Shammi, why have you got that up there? Because we call each other Pole. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is, again, another example. But you have to talk to people to understand what it is they want to be described as. And if we can't have those conversations, particularly if you're working in a school where you've got a diverse community, if we can't have these conversations, what do we even know about our families and our children? We're supposed to be serving the communities, right? But if we can't even talk about their culture and who they are and because we're worried about what we're going to say, how are you going to make adjustments to your curriculum or try to make it more inclusive if they all look like they're Pakistani, but actually they're not, they're Persian, they're this, they come from Afghanistan, but actually to, I don't know, someone leading the school, well, they all look Pakistani to me and they all kind of speak the same because it all sounds the same. And when that happens is you're missing out on all this, these opportunities where you can really bring those children alive just by recognizing who they are and where they're from. And then the journey can, you can make it a positive thing. You can make it a negative thing. It's up to us, really. So, yeah, sorry, I go on.
No, I think it's great, but there's something, I know we're a bit pushed for time, but there's something I wanted to kind of put in there, and I think this is something that we are discussing in this space as educators a lot more, but the importance when we're talking about identity and exploring, you know, someone's lived life experience and their history and their ancestors' history. And we're actually really kind of getting to grips with identity, and therefore the changes we're going to make in our department to our curriculum, you know, to the way that we deliver something, the way we discuss and open up and celebrate those conversations. Actually, I think there's something I always proactively try and think about, you know, come September, or even when I'm covering a class, is how we pronounce children's names, or how we pronounce staff names, or how we spell staff names, and what we do to rectify the errors that we make. And I mean, there have been many times when I've read a register out of a cover class and I'm like, I usually say at the start, you know, apologies, I don't normally teach you, but it's important to me that I pronounce your name correctly. Please don't let me mispronounce it, because your name is deeply important to me, to you. And I don't think we can do identity justice if we can't even do the labels of the names of an identity and the superficial parts. You know, so I think come September, I think a lot of us already do that work, and we already do ask those questions. But again, it's about feeling safe. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Please educate me. And I often write down the phonetic spelling just in my register. I'm like, because I would hate it if I went through life and someone was like, I don't know, my name gets spelt so many ways, you know, lousy, boys. There's so many. The amount of birthday cards I've had.
That to you.
It's like I hug all the vowels, and people are like, oh, I'm just going to put them in any order and hope for the best. There's an L at the start and an E at the end. But you know, so much so, my eldest, one of my middle sisters, called
Sorry, I'm laughing because I used to do it to you all the time.
Yes. But the thing is, but that's the important thing. It's how you rectify it. It's also about thinking, do you know what? It might not mean as much to me because of my life experience, because I don't regularly experience microaggressions in the workplace. And so when someone misspells my name, it's oh God, I'm a louse again, or I'm lousy, and it's just, oh, whatever. But for many colleagues or students, that's literally the spark that's lit a bonfire, because there have been numerous microaggressions in the workplace or at school that haven't been properly tackled. And so when someone mispronounces a name repeatedly, or, you know, isn't spelling the name correctly in an email, it's like poof. So when you say, oh, you know, someone's like, oh, they've just misspelled it again. No, it's not. They've just misspelled it again. Think about where that colleague and where that student has come from. That day, they might have experienced 4, 5, 6 microaggressions, comments about their hair, you know, saying, oh, you know, you're well educated for so and so, for where you've come. All these really, really horrible microaggressions that we need to be tackling.
I'm laughing. It's not funny. It's not funny, but it does. You're absolutely right, Louise. And I say, you know, because I think I'm laughing because I'm thinking about something. Right, when in a school where I started, and I had a sixth form class, and it was very diverse, and I think I may have been one of the first, or one of the, you know, first, not first, but I had a tutor group, and every form tutor had to read out the names of the children and then take them back to the classroom. I remember all my colleagues doing it, and, you know, the names were quite difficult. You know, got some Sri Lankan names, some Nigerian names. If you're not familiar with them, it is difficult to read. But the more you practice, you just know it. You know, like what you're doing, Louise, is brilliant, and your colleagues are doing. And a lot of people do that now. Lots of people are really mindful of that in a way that I think even 2-3 years ago they weren't. And people are actually making more of an effort, and because it's talked about. Because again, once you open up the door to these conversations, it's no longer a problem to talk about it. We're helping each other. But I remember reading through every single name without a problem, and the whole of the sixth form clapped. Like about 250 of them just went, yeah, like that. And I just realized what had happened, that actually I was the first person that read out the names without struggling. And I thought, okay, this is really funny, but actually this is really sad, because my colleagues wouldn't have done that deliberately. They just didn't, you know, if you haven't come across a name, how Irish names, you know, I've done that many times, you know. So I think, again, goes back to basics. Just ask, just say, Don't worry if you get it wrong. Repeat it, and once you've got it for life. And then, you know, you get another child from, you know, with a similar sounding name. You're getting closer to it. So, yeah, good for you, Louise. I think the more we do that, and some children might just say, no, I just want to be called John. They may have just said that, because I remember my family, you know, you're going to laugh at this, but my name, everyone that I know from Luton doesn't know me as Shammi. They know me as Dolly. Dolly was like my nickname, because we were all given traditional English names by our parents. My middle sister's Diana, because my mum and dad loved Princess Diana. You know, they stopped at the third sister. They were like, can't be bothered anymore. Just call her whatever.
Make her royal.
Yeah. But, you know, actually our parents, I think, tried to do that to make it easy. And, you know, nowadays what I hear, you know, a lot of my family, like you know, Zachariah, because Zach is easier to pronounce. So, you know, Daniel, you know, you've got different versions of kind of biblical Quranic names that are sounding Western and more Adam. You know, people are using names to stick to their tradition, but also try to make it easier. So again, just ask people, don't worry, you know, and people actually respect you for caring. They do, they care, they care. They know that actually I'm sending my children to a school where, you know, the teachers actually are trying and they care, and you've got instant respect. You've got instant respect for the staff, and those little things are big things.
Definitely. So I want to thank you, because we've talked. I know we're coming close to the end of our time. We've actually gone on.
Okay. It's been really good.
Discussion.
I've really enjoyed this.
But we've talked about so many things. We've touched upon kind of psychological safety in the workplace, the importance of building relationships so that colleagues and students can have, you know, inclusive discussions. We've talked about having, you know, designing, you know, previously ethnocentric curricula and thinking about how we can make those more inclusive, and also talking about the importance of having representation at leadership level as well as at colleague and student. This is a really big final question that I'm gonna leave you with.
Anything
Bearing in mind all those things we've talked about this evening, if listeners take away one key thing about how to build or contribute to an inclusive school, bearing in mind faith, representation, ethnicity, gender, sex, all the different parts of identity, one thing about building an inclusive school, what would you say? It's big, isn't it?
I know what I want to say. We need our leaders to be brave. We need our white leaders, particularly, to be a lot braver than what we're seeing right now. I know there are some great, you know, people doing some great work. We need not, as racially minoritized people, to be pushed to the front, or our children pushed to the front to try and solve these problems. We need to stand. We need protection, because this is difficult stuff, right? But we need to be more, you know, I'm going to go back to my mom, you know, be more like a family. We need our leaders to lead in this space, and our leaders are predominantly white. And if our leaders are worried or, you know, not sure about how to approach, invite us to the room. You know, don't be afraid, and don't stand behind us, stand beside us. And sometimes we need you to stand in front of us, but we need people to be brave. And it's easy for me to say this, I think, because I've talked to you about so much, right? And I know when I'm in a room when individuals are not comfortable with me being in certain spaces where they might think I don't belong, because they're not used to seeing people of color in certain spaces. A lot of Black and brown people will know, because we have had a life experience of dealing with racism. We know when we're in the company. We know when, for example, we should be grateful for what we have, and all those sorts of, we have heard all the comments and we've had to do what our parents have said is, get your head down. Don't just work hard. Just do your thing. But I'm 45 now, and I'm going to leave you with this, right? I'm 45 years old. I grew up in this country. I went to school. I'm going to go back to one of the first things I talked about, which was my grandfather. I never sat in an assembly during, Remembrance Day, when we had our Remembrance Assemblies, ever anyone mentioning Black and Asian soldiers that fought for this country. I taught in different secondary schools in different parts of where, local area. Never did I sit through an assembly where it was talked about. My children, they are, one's going to be 20, the other's going to be 16. Yes, I know I look young. It's okay.
So I was just thinking, is she nearly 20?
Yeah, she is. She's nearly 20. She's studying history as well. Studying history.
We love that. We love that for her.
Every year, yes, yeah. And every year I would ask them, just subtly, I don't want to make a big deal. Was it mentioned that Black and Asian soldiers fought in the war? Every year, I say, no, mummy. So I know that these are, there are schools that are doing this work, but I also know, given that, I'm from a massive family, big Asian community, get together at weddings. And what I want to say is, people are talking in their own private spaces, in weddings, about these things in every institution that they work in. We are second, some third generation British born, work. This isn't just a problem in education, it's everywhere. And so be brave. Don't rely on us to be brave. We're not afraid. We are brave. We're not afraid at all, because we've dealt with some of the worst things that have happened in the past, and we've come out of that. And my mum and dad always said, never ever blame people for anything, never ever generalize about communities, because they come from a land which was torn by war and destruction and hatred. They got no time for that, and they raised us that way. They said, just put your head down. Doesn't matter if people say horrible things to you. Most people are kind. Most people are good. Remember that. And they drilled that in us. A lot of us have every excuse to be angry and to be upset, but we have been brought up to make sure that that anger doesn't seep into our hearts and that we use it for good. And I would say we need, if we're talking about education, we need our white leaders to be braver. And, invite us in the room. We want to help. We don't. So that's where I'll stop. But I'm going to say, Louise, I'm really grateful that you invited me, and it's been so lovely. And I can't believe it took a podcast for us to get together. But I have really enjoyed.
It's been 6 years.
I just pretended like nobody's listening, actually.
Next time there'll be a coffee. But thank you so much, because I've learned so much from listening, and I hope that our listeners, and we've got over 300 online at the moment.
Oh wow, really?
Yes. So thank you like for listening. No, there's a lot. So thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And I hope you've had some key takeaways from this, what I feel is an amazing discussion with you, Shammi. And Shammi, have you heard about our Teachers Talk radio newsletter? Have you heard of this?
No, but I do. I want to say that to Tom. I just think it's so good. Like, you bring so many different people, different discussions. I do tap into when I can. And I think, oh, wow, this is so great. Being creative and, so no, I don't, but I will promote it in my work for sure. I think, what you're doing is so fantastic. So, guitar. Oh, thank you. Someone just
thank you, Guitar God. That's great.
Thank you.
And we did also have a lovely comment from Grace earlier that I just kind of wanted to pop up when we were talking about having right or wrong answers in the workplace and actually opinions being equally valid. So thank you, Grace. I think that it's lovely to to know that we're all on a similar wavelength. But yeah, thank you so much, Shammi. It'd be great to maybe get you back on the show again and talk about some of these things in a bit more depth another time. But lovely. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a lovely evening. I will be here again in a fortnight time with Mike Lehman discussing teachers leaving teaching, reasons why, and next steps. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.